If you really have a hard time going to sleep, you can read the book that I used to create the outline for tonight. This is volume 2 of the story of Christianity by Justo Gonzalez. So, you didn't get an outline? Like you literally could have tripped over that table. Yes. So, our sources for tonight are, like I said, The Story of Christianity by Justo Gonzalez. This is one of our seminary books. And you can tell that my wife read the book, but maybe some of those underlines were mine as well. And then also I'm using the Christianity Today article on John Wesley. And those can be found on your sources footnote there. So, none of this language is necessarily mine, but I'm going to try my best to summarize it so that I'm not just reading to you and you can read what you have already. So we're going to do tonight is on who is John Wesley. You have to start, a movement starts with a person or a group of individuals. And the Methodist movement starts with John Wesley. You do not have Methodism without John Wesley. And so if we're going to talk about the history of Methodism, we have to start at its core and the seed that was planted by John Wesley. So, who is John Wesley? Well, John Wesley was son of an Anglican priest. His mother was the daughter of an Anglican priest. They lived in a parsonage. His brother, Charles, is an Anglican priest. I don't know necessarily who else in the family was an Anglican priest. I'm assuming there was a whole clan of Anglican priests. It was like, this is who we are, this is what we do kind of thing. It was the family trade. And so it was expected of him that he was going to get an education, of course. His book was kind of written for him at birth. He escapes a fire in the parsonage, and apparently it was a miraculous occurrence that he did not die. His mother said that he was saved by God for a future purpose, that God had a plan for him. And so it was God's providence that he was saved by that fire. So father's name is Samuel, mother's name is Susanna. The childhood home, well, I guess not that one, because that one burned, but the parsonage in which they continue to live is still like a historic site in England. You can go there today. If you want to go on a Wesley pilgrimage, you can go. I have never been on a Wesley pilgrimage, but maybe one day. I've never been to England. So there you go. Goes to Oxford, and when he was in Oxford, he joined a religious society founded by his brother Charles and a group of friends. So this was part of the piety movement. The pietism was this new fervor that was growing within Christianity at that time. There was this desire to live a pious life, and the piety was, as you see at the top, it was a response to the dogmatism of theologians and the rationalism of philosophers. And it was to really be at the heart of who a Christian was. It was not just what we believed, but how we lived our beliefs, who we were. And so they were very much intent on leading and living a holy life. They held a covenant together. They took communion weekly. They were faithful in private devotions. They visited the prisons, which is not the same as prisons today, by the way. I was thinking about doing some research on this, but I didn't get to it today. But what was the prison system like in England in the 1700s? Prisoners in England were those who maybe owed a debt to somebody. They were locked up in prison. Maybe they were doing something that the king didn't like, and so they were imprisoned for that. And so we're talking about old school England, in which, the Church of England had been established, but there was very much this tie between religion and the law. And so even if they broke a religious vow, they could have been imprisoned for that. So we're not talking about drug dealing and arms dealing. We're talking about, different things that would have gotten them into jail. So we're talking about people who needed hope, which is still the same today in our prisons. People in prison need hope. They need to be offered the love and grace of Jesus Christ, just like anybody else. So anyways, they would visit the prison, and they would spend 3 hours together every afternoon. That is a lot of time, studying the Bible and reading devotionals. So you can just imagine, just use your imagination as to what this kind of fraternity was like. They inherited a nickname called the Holy Club, which was the custom at that time. If somebody gave you a nickname that was meant to be a slanderous, you took it and owned it. Think of the way colleges do that today. Like a college will start making fun of another college, and then that college will take that and they'll run with it, or a group of people, anyways. So they took that name and they started calling themselves the Holy Club. So one interesting fact that is not mentioned in your outline, John Wesley was the only ordained Anglican priest at that time who was a member of the Holy Club. And so because of that, he became one of the leaders of the Holy Club. So what happens next is really the root of the John Wesley story. He gets called by Governor Oglethorpe to Savannah, Georgia, to be an Anglican missionary in the British colonies over there. Now, I have been to Savannah, Georgia. My family goes to Savannah quite often because my parents used to live there. And there's a statue in Savannah, Georgia of John Wesley, and there's a memorial marker on one of the squares in Savannah, Georgia. I don't have any photos tonight to show you, but yeah, you can look it up on Google it. There you go. So what happened was he's going on this missionary journey to Savannah, and he's hoping to convert the Native Americans. And on the way there was a storm at sea. And now I had always known about this story, that there was a storm at sea, but I didn't know the extent of it until today, reading again my history book, that the main mast of the ship broke. So we're talking about, this is a pretty dangerous situation. It wasn't just like Jesus and the disciples, oh, we're dying, save us kind of thing. It was, the ship actually broke. The main mast of the ship broke. Now what happens is, John Wesley is in fear for his life. And he was the chaplain of the ship. And here he is crying out in fear for his life. On the same ship is a Moravian missionary group, German Moravians who were coming over to do missionary work as well. And the Moravians had been doing missionary work just like the Anglicans had been. And so on the ship he learns enough German in his conversations with some of the Moravians that when he gets off the ship, he asks one of the Moravian leaders about their faith. Because on the ship, they're singing songs, they're singing hymns, praising God. They're not fearing for their life like he is. And he notices this contrast between this devout faith of the Moravians versus his faith. He's really has a crisis of faith in this moment. And so the Moravian, Spangenberg, is who he asks for advice on his mission to the Indians. And this man asks him several questions, but the root of it is, do you have a faith in Christ? Is what the Moravian is asking him. And he says, yes, I do. But later, looking back on this, John Wesley points to this in his journals and says, I really didn't. I said that I did, but I didn't. And he says, I fear that those were vain words. And so he's really having this crisis of faith. That's a good question. I'm thinking in his 20s at this point. No, not yet, because he does return to Oxford after this. So he might have graduated with his undergraduate degree and then gone back for his master's of divinity or whatever was required of an Anglican priest at that time. I'm not sure what those educational requirements were at that time. That's a good question. You should Google that one, Dick. What were the educational requirements of an Anglican priest in the 1700s at Oxford? Single spaced, 12-point font, and 1-inch margins. 1 inch. So, 32. There you go. 32 years old. So the mission failed for several reasons. Can you imagine that? A crisis of faith in his mission fails. So he expected the parishioners to behave like the Holy Club at Oxford. All right, so imagine that. That didn't work. And his flock expected him just to be content with their regular worship attendance. You know, we're not going to do anything other than come to church. You're expecting us to do what? Meet 3 hours a day? No, that's not working here. And then his brother Charles was also doing a missionary journey at the same time with Oglethorpe, and he had already returned to England because Charles was having a fruitless mission as well. But Wesley was very stubborn. He wanted to try to make it work, and he left in disgrace because he was interested in a woman. She wasn't interested in him. She married somebody else, and then he has her outcast from the church. So he showed her. He refuses her communion, and then he gets sued for defamation. And so then he's got to go back to England. Karen, would you mind shutting the door for me? I appreciate it. So, you know, honestly, the truth of the matter is, upon getting this stuff together today, and I had a good conversation with Travis on Sunday, I could really relate to John Wesley in many, many ways. I really can. So he goes back to England, and he seeks out this Moravian pastor as a religious advisor. And he's having this crisis of faith, and he says, I need to stop preaching. I need to give it up. And I really like this guy because his advice to John Wesley comes out of experience, and it comes out of wisdom, and it was exactly what he needed to hear. And I think to myself, I wish that I had a spiritual advisor like this man at this point in my faith journey. And this man tells him, you don't need to stop preaching. You need to preach faith until you get faith. And then once you get faith, you need to continue preaching that faith that you have. And that, to me, just imagine somebody encouraging you like that. You know, when you're down in the dumps and when you feel like you're worthless, having somebody lift you up like that. And fake it till you make it. Exactly. Yeah. And so he continued to do that. Now, of all the things that are happening up until this point, May 24th, 1738, is the day of John Wesley. This is the day that goes down in the books, because this is the day of his conversion. This is the day where he has what we call as United Methodists, or just Methodists. This is what he calls his Aldersgate experience. Now, there are Methodist churches that are called Aldersgate Methodist churches because of this. You didn't whoop. Thought you have to whoop. Yeah, there's several churches. There's an Aldersgate. I think there's a few Aldersgates in our Central Texas Conference of the United Methodist Church, but it is a classic Methodist church name, Aldersgate United Methodist Church. And so he's at Aldersgate Street, and they're having their club meeting. And it doesn't say who, but someone is reading Luther's preface to the Epistle of Romans. And it's when these words are said, he was describing the change which God works in the heart through faith in Christ. And John Wesley says, I felt my heart strangely warmed. Now, it could have been that he had Mexican food for dinner. But he's going to give it to Christ. He said, I did trust in Christ, Christ alone for salvation, and an assurance was given to me that he had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death. So this is the moment of conversion for John Wesley. So the next piece is also important because it's his relationship with George Whitefield, who is another mover and shaker at this time. George Whitefield's American mission and his preaching in the colonies was world-renowned. And this is the beginning of, you talk to Baptists, Presbyterians, you talk to Disciples of Christ, you talk to Church of Christ, you talk to Bible churches. They all have their roots with Whitefield in America. Field preacher, when he got here, really started a revival movement, part of the Great Awakening in America. But at this time, he's a member of the Holy Club with John Wesley. And he is a very passionate preacher. He invites John Wesley to become a part of what he's doing because George Whitefield is going to be coming to America. And so Wesley takes the offer and he starts preaching with Whitefield. Now, there's another piece here that's important, is that Whitefield is a field preacher, not just because of his name, but because of what happens when he's preaching to the people who were outcast from the church. He's preaching to the people who are the lower rung of society. And we have to think about, in 1700 England, the classism that existed. If people weren't dressed properly, they could not attend church. If people weren't of a certain class and didn't give to the church, they couldn't attend church. There was an outcast of society. There was very much a classism. And this time, it wasn't uncommon for people to own their own pews in a church or a booth, and they would set it up, and it was very high society. He was an Anglican priest. Yes, he was an Anglican priest. He had not left the church yet, not at this time. And so John Wesley, with his new devotion to Christ and his heart strangely warmed, he didn't think, he was a very orderly person. And in fact, he was almost obsessive compulsive. And there's a lot of Wesley historians that will say that John Wesley was OCD, that he took notes about everything. He journaled all the time. He had a timetable. He was always working on a clock. He knew how many people were a part of everything that he was involved in. He took notes like crazy. And so it was that organization that was really an asset to this movement. And it was because of his organization that he became one of the leaders of this movement with Whitefield out of Bristol in England. But he had to come to terms with what Whitefield was doing, because that seemed odd to him. He didn't think that there could be any conversion of somebody outside the church, that somebody could repent of their sins outside of a sanctuary. He wanted it to be orderly. He wanted to be sure that he was doing the right things. Eventually, he does come around, and it's going to be to the benefit of the future of the Methodist movement, because everything that Wesley does from this point on is going to be outside or adjacent to what the Church of England is doing. So this movement grows as a movement that is adjacent to what the church is doing. He makes a point that he's not going to schedule any of the class meetings or the bands or the society meetings on a day in which they're having a church service. He doesn't want to interfere with what the Church of England is doing, because he believes that communion is at the very heart of Christianity. And so just to keep that in mind, that what we have become as Methodists in America, most especially, versus what John Wesley originally had in mind for the Methodist movement, was that they would be having communion every day. I mean, every at least once a week, that they would be participating in the sacrament of Holy Communion. Now, where we have, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more depth when we talk about Methodism in America, we have shifted that not for any other reason but historic reasons, that we have communion once a month. And the history of that is that the circuit riders in America were lay circuit riders, and they could not, the circuit riders were ministers, but the circuit riders could only get to a church on average of once a month. And then the other Sundays, the church services were being led by lay people. So the lay people could not serve the communion, but the circuit rider could. So when the circuit rider came to town, they'd have communion that Sunday. And it was on average of once a month that a circuit rider attended a church on the circuit. Every other Sunday was lay-led. Now, something that does continue that we see is the power of the laity. And that is something in this time and in this situation that is incredible, is the power of the laity. And I'm jumping ahead of myself on that. So Wesley is with Whitefield, and they do work together for some time, but then they eventually part because of theological differences. And I listed these theological differences there. Wesley becomes more of the faction of our Arminianism, and we'll talk more of theology later. And Whitefield becomes more of a Calvinist. And so Whitefield actually begins a new denomination. He calls it the Calvinist Anglican Church. So he starts this new denomination where he tries to integrate his Anglicanism with Calvinism and runs with that. And Wesley holds on to the Arminian concepts that deny predestination, affirm free will, and affirm entire sanctification. And so, but we'll talk about those theological concepts at another time. But those were the main differences between the two of them, and then they ended up parting ways. So what happens is Wesley stays in Bristol. Whitefield goes and does his missionary work. No, the Presbyterian Church would have been started by the, what is his name? John Calvin. So John Calvin would have started the Presbyterian concept. Yeah. The tulip theory, TULIP is an acronym for total depravity, limited something. I can't remember the acronym, but it's called the TULIP theory, is what Calvinists believe. So it's there's just some distinction between different theologies there. So Wesley had no intention of founding a new denomination, and we need to be reminded of that. Wesley died an Anglican priest. He wanted to be an Anglican priest. He didn't want to separate his movement from the Anglican Church. What did I say here? His purpose was to awaken and cultivate the faith of the masses in the Church of England, as Pietism was doing for the German Lutherans. So the piety is what he's pushing. He's pushing a holiness of life, which was not seen at that time. The holiness of life was what was missing. And you talk about the classism, you had the upper class that was using their financial resources to get what they wanted in terms of favor with the church. We don't have a separation of church and state. We have a marriage of church and state. And so the wealthy were getting what they wanted from the church, including the leadership of the country. Okay? At the same time, you have the lower class society, the working class society, the labor class, who is really who John Wesley is working with. He's kind of done trying to convert the upper class. His mission is with the lower class, the working class. And so those are the ones who really want to change their life. Those are the ones who see that there's a benefit to surrendering their life to Christ. There's a benefit to what John Wesley is offering them. Order in their life, some routine, and some devotion to God. With that comes prosperity. And it's not because of John Wesley is promising any form of prosperity. It's when you start ordering your life in the way God wants you to order your life, things are going to start working out for you. And so that's what happens, that the societies that he starts, they just start booming. And more people, there's this religious fervor that starts. There's just this excitement. All these people want to be part of this movement because they're seeing lives change. They're seeing things working out for this person, and all of a sudden this person's, they were, for one reason or another, they were in despair, and now they've been pulled out of despair because of their devotion to God and their relationship with the society. And then you begin to see some of the upper class being involved in this because they see what's happening to the lower class. And then there's this marriage that starts happening between the upper class and the working class within these societies. And so then you have this cultivation that's happening that would not have happened had it been within the bounds of the church. So John Wesley, remember, he's working adjacent to the church. He's not working away from the church. He's trying to bring this religious movement into the Anglican church. And that's his hope. And what does it say here? He was hoping that the Methodist meetings would serve as preparation to attend the Anglican service. That he was hoping that what he was doing would really ignite the Church of England. But that's not what happened. And in fact, they begin to become slandered. His movement becomes slandered. His movement takes upon the name the Methodists because, once again, like the Holy Club, they were using that language to mock the societies. Oh, look at your methods. Y'all have this method of meeting every day. You have this method of gathering together. You have this method of doing what the Holy Club was doing. And so then they took that name and they owned it. Well, fine, we'll be called the Methodists. If that's what you're going to call us, then we'll take that name and we'll claim it. And just like they did at the Holy Club in Oxford, they take that name and they said, this is who we are. We are Methodists. So it was continuing the fervor in Bristol. The societies grow to the point of further division. They start making classes, which were 11 members with a leader. And these classes, they would meet together weekly, read scripture, pray, discuss religious matters, and collect funds. In addition to the classes, there was a subgroup called the bands. And the band was about 2 or 3 people that had like an intense accountability group. Not everyone was in a band. But I think, from my understanding, it was more like a leader, 2 or 3 leaders would get together and they would have a band. And that band would hold each other accountable, and their expectations of one another was more elevated than what they were expecting out of the classes. So the class leaders didn't have to be educated or wealthy. So it gave significant participation to many who felt out of place in the organized church. And in addition to that, they had classes that were for men and classes that were for women. They did not have co-ed classes. So they would have men's classes and women's classes. And what comes with that is the necessity for female leadership. Where females did not have leadership in the church, they had leadership in the Methodist societies, which is something that continues to happen within the Methodist church, is that necessity for female leadership. And that there's a lot of history there in the Methodist church and a lot of pride that we have been a denomination that has invested in female leadership. So I've underlined 3 different things in your outline. One of them is this saying of John Wesley that happens around this time to really increase that the devotion of the classes and the societies. Do all the good you can by all the means you can in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, at all the times you can, to all the people you can, as long as ever you can. And so John Wesley was one of these poets, like his brother George, who wrote, who wrote several of the hymns in our hymn book. Charles Wesley did. And so John Wesley had this way of helping people remember things by repetition. Do all the good you can, by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, at all the times you can, to all the people you can, as long as ever you can. And then when the bishop objected to this movement, John Wesley responds, "The world is my parish." So these are two sayings right now that have continued. His heart was strangely warmed is an important thing to remember. The saying, "The world is my parish," is another saying of John Wesley that's important to remember. And that slogan would be used for Methodist missionaries forever. We still use that today. So the employment of lay preachers is an important part in this where we are now. He employs lay preachers because he can't do all the work for himself. And they're not allowed to serve communion, but they're allowed to do ministry in conjunction with his work. So then he further organizes everyone into a connection, which is a group of societies under a circuit, under the leadership of a superintendent. The Methodist clergy get together with the lay leaders, the lay preachers, and they join together once a year at an annual conference. And those who were serving the circuit were appointed, usually for 3 years. Now, this breakdown is still in place essentially today, where we are part of an annual conference. The pastors are appointed by the bishop to serve an appointment. And now it's typically longer than 3 years. And we have district superintendents. You know, a lot of this is still the same even today. And then in this part, this is the moment, this legal decision, this legal disagreement that happens in 1778 is the beginning of a new denomination. So what happens is, in order for a church to be registered, in order for them to be registered as Anglican priests, they have to be following the rules of the Anglican Church. And they have to be meeting in a building. And they have to be organized within a structure. And they no longer fell into this category because of the movement. This is not what Wesley wanted, but it's just what happened. And so if they didn't register as ministers, then they would be breaking the law, and then they would be thrown in jail. So they had to register themselves as ministers, but they had to register themselves as non-Anglican ministers. Not John Wesley, because he was ordained, but the lay ministers had to register themselves. And so John Wesley tells them, you have to register, because we can't risk you being thrown in prison. So they do. They register, and they have to register as non-Anglican. And so this is the point where things start to shift for the Methodist movement. And this is the point where it becomes no longer part of the Church of England. John Wesley continues to be an Anglican minister, but the lay pastors are no longer registered under the Anglican title. They become just under the title of non-Anglican. So they're not registering as Methodists. They're just registering as non-Anglican ministers. And so this is the kind of this beginning of something new point. The Episcopal Church is the Church of England. Yeah, in America, but not yet. I don't know when the American take the name Episcopal separate from the Anglican. I don't know that time schedule or that timeline. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, but at this point, they're still having the Civil War. So the church in America is still an Anglican church. It's still the Church of England in America. It's not taking an Episcopal title yet. So they're still having the Civil War is still undergoing. So there's still the Revolutionary War is still happening, the War of Independence. So I don't know if that separation from the Church of England to an Anglican church has happened yet. I'm assuming it happens within time after the war, after we declared independence. And that's actually what happens next in the outline is because of the Declaration of Independence, the Bishop of London, who had jurisdiction over the colonies, is not going to ordain anybody else in America. And because of that, and the Anglican priests that were in America were loyalists to England, and most of them left America and returned to England after the war. So what happens is Americans or United States citizens are now without anyone to serve them communion. They're kind of left high and dry. Now, John Wesley felt both ways about this. You know, he felt pity for them that they didn't have anyone to serve them communion. At the same time, he felt pity that they were separating themselves from England. He thought that was petty. So he saw both sides of it. That the war was unnecessary was his belief, but at the same time he had sorrow and felt pity for those who were kind of stranded without ministers. So it's out of that devotion to the Americans that he sends Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury as one of those ordained lay preachers, and Thomas Coke, and I don't remember who the third person is, but in 1784 he commissions them to America. And so think about Thomas Coke, Francis Asbury is where we get the name Cokesbury, which is the United Methodist Publishing House today. So the name Cokesbury, our publishing house, comes from Coke and Asbury. Now, there's Asbury Theological Seminary in Kentucky is a seminary. There's Asbury United Methodist Churches. I don't know of any churches that are named after Thomas Coke. I've never heard of a Coke Methodist church. There might be some. If there would probably be on the East Coast, somewhere over there. But I've never heard of a Coke Methodist church. So just a fun fact that Wesley did not just send missionaries to America. Wesley sent missionaries to Scotland. Wesley sent missionaries to other countries. I don't know what other countries he sent missionaries to, but I do know he sent missionaries to Scotland as well. So after his death, Methodism underwent a period of struggles, mostly revolving around the relations with Anglicanism. Eventually, the churches in England and other lands where Methodists had grown strong, churches were eventually formed away from the Anglican church. They were just independent Methodist churches upon his death, and this is the OCD keeping numbers. He knew everything. There were 294 preachers. He didn't even round up. It's like 294 preachers, 71,668 members, 19 missionaries in 5 mission stations. And in America, there were 43,265 American members and 198 preachers in America when he died. And today, Methodism numbers about 30 million people worldwide. It's a pretty large denomination. And that's not just United Methodism. That's anyone who calls himself a Methodist worldwide. Yeah. That would be outside of England. Yeah. Outside of England. Uh-huh. Oh, really? Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. So, outside of the packet that I've given you tonight, just some things I want us to think about. These are just some questions that came to mind. What would it look like? What would a religious society like the Holy Club? How would you think that would be received today? If you had gone to a university that had a Holy Club like that met every day for 3 hours a day, the religious fervor, the sobriety, all of this, how would that be received today? You think that would be something that a cult? That's right. That's right. Something to reflect on, though, is where have we come from, and where are we now? It's interesting, as a Methodist pastor who knows Methodist history and knows the roots of Wesleyanism and this religious piety that they lived by. One of the funny things that I hear now as people who join a Methodist church, I like being a Methodist because I can drink. And we don't frown upon it. Well, no, we don't punish it. But there's a reason why we use grape juice instead of wine. And there's a reason why we don't, and honestly, Methodism has a history of preaching sobriety, preaching abstinence, preaching this pious life. And so it's interesting that where we've come from and where we are now, there's a little bit of a contrast there between those things. What is Wesley's story of faith or lack of faith? Does it surprise you? Are you surprised by that? Anybody? Yeah? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think he would consider himself a Methodist because he was part of that movement. But I don't think his intent wasn't to start a new denomination. Yeah.
He still considered himself an Anglican.
Yeah.
Preacher.
An Anglican priest who was like a Methodist Anglican priest. Not necessarily beginning a new denomination called Methodist, but that movement within the Anglican Church was still labeled Methodist before it was its own denomination. Yeah. Yeah. I think that you can tell, you can see the difference before the conversion and after the conversion. You know, it's no wonder that his mission in Savannah failed. It's no wonder that he was trying to punish the woman who didn't love him back. You know, it's well, I'm going to show you because, I mean, who was he? What was he standing for at that time? Versus after the conversion, what happens? And really, I look at that moment that Moravian advisor, you know, that was really a powerful moment for him. And I think that advice that he received, that, like you said, Molly, fake it till you make it, that was the advice that he needed at that time to really push him into a place where then he's more aware of his own desire for that. And then hearing the words of Luther as his friend is reading the preface to Romans, it just, everything at that moment clicked for him. And that moment, it was kind of a powerful conversion experience. It was like this coming in and this coming in and this coming in all at the same time just exploded. And then that was his born again kind of recreated experience, where the person who he was no longer the person who he became. And you see that just taking off because of his experience and his change of life. Yep. Exactly. He wanted, and Luther had a heart as well for the lower class, the working class. He wanted to minister to those working class people. He wanted to get the word of God into the hands of people. Because the church was keeping it away from people, he wanted to give the word to people and empower them. Yeah, Alan. I don't think so. I think that all that had resolved itself at this point. And in fact, you see a watered down church at this point that needs this religious revival. And so kind of like in parallel to what's happened with Luther, you have this revival happening, and it's not just Wesley. I mean, it's Whitefield, it's a lot of other people who see the same thing at the same time. The Moravians and even the Lutherans are preaching piety at this time as well. It's just kind of this primed location. So in England, the Catholic and Protestantism battle had already subdued, and the Protestantism is at a point to where it's watered down. And it's needing that revival. So does that answer your question?
Yes,
Yeah.
it's just that I'm amazed is that in this
I don't believe so. I don't believe so. I think what grew out of it was larger than anyone could ever imagine. And I think that that's the same thing as what we're experiencing is continual calling for revival. And I think that this, why we're doing this, these teaching sessions, and where we are right now in our denomination, are we being called into a revival? Is our denomination being called into a revival? Or, what's going on? Where is the religious fervor? Where is the piety? Where is that desire to live that holy life? And so there's a lot of connection between that and where we are as well. I want to honor our time tonight. I think I had a couple of more questions. Next week, we're going to talk about the people called Methodists. We're going to do a little bit more digging into what were the class meetings like, what were the societies like. We'll do the Methodism in America. So this is the kind of organization we're going to go with. We talked about John Wesley today. Next week, we'll talk about the people called Methodists. The following week, we'll talk about Christianity or Methodism in America. And then the next week, we'll look at it from a global perspective, because United Methodism is a global denomination. It's not an American denomination, it's a global denomination. And we'll look at how that affects us even here in Texas, and our missionaries all over the world, and how that's been set up. So that's our organization of this. I hope y'all have had a good time tonight. Hope it's been educational. And I'll see y'all next week.